Hi guys, this video is for APUS. Today we're going to talk about we're going to continue talking about President Eisenhower and some of his Cold War policies. We talked in the last video about his unique approach. He believed in stopping the rapid expansion of military spending, and he felt like we should rely more on nuclear weapons in order to keep the peace with the Soviet Union. Despite that, his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, was a big advocate of brinksmanship, so a very aggressive approach with regard to the Soviet Union, at least rhetorically. And Eisenhower was behind a lot of third world adventures in the name of containing communism. Particularly the CIA overthrowing several governments in the third world, which had, as we discussed, like some pretty serious consequences. So today we're going to focus on two areas of Cold War policy in the 1950s: the Middle East and Cuba. Okay, so let's start with the Middle East. Now, the Middle East was taking on greater importance for the United States during this time. One, we were very dependent on foreign oil. In the 1950s, we were becoming much more of a car-centric society, even more than we had been in the past. Which we'll talk about in subsequent videos, with the increase in suburbanization and all of that. So we were dependent on foreign oil, particularly oil from the Middle East. We were also developing much closer ties with the state of Israel. And that often meant inserting ourselves in the middle of a lot of squabbles between Arab nations. In order to protect Israel, as we saw it, but also Cold War politics. Cold War politics figured into everything in the 1950s, and the Russians, the Soviets, were trying to draw a wedge between us and the Middle East by actually developing much closer ties with Arab nations. So we were close to Israel, so the Soviet Union geopolitically decided to develop stronger ties with the Arab nations. Now, this was something that was certainly, benefited them, because that gave them access to oil, that gave them in their mind a geopolitical advantage over the United States. And a lot of these ties were long and deep. Like, for instance, during the Syrian Civil War, of the past decade, the Syrian regime had enormous support from the Russians. The Russians actually saved Assad at certain points in the Civil War when it looked like he was going to lose. That seemed kind of random, how is Russia getting involved in the Syrian Civil War? But that can actually be traced back to the Cold War years, when the Soviets, the Russians, were developing close ties with the Arab nations, in order to draw a wedge between us and the Arab nations, particularly over the Israeli issue. Interestingly, the Russians also kept ties with the Israelis too, but not as close as they had with some of the Arab nations. Now, the preeminent Arab leader in the 1950s was a man named Gamal Nasser. Now, Nasser was the president of Egypt, and he was a big proponent of Arab nationalism. Now, Arab nationalism, interestingly, in the 1950s, was very different than what we might think of as Middle East nationalism today, which has a much more, Islamic religious flavor. Nasser's nationalism was really more secular. In fact, Nasser gave an unbelievable speech in 1958 in front of a group of Egyptian politicians where he mocked religious Muslims, saying that, they even want me to pass a law saying that women should cover their heads. And the audience just laughed, because that just seemed so preposterous for this 1950s Egyptian political audience. So it's very interesting that the father of Arab nationalism actually was a very secular, or at least was a fairly secular leader himself. Now, Nasser wanted to develop friendlier relations with the Soviet Union, or at least take a more neutral stance with regard to the Cold War, hoping that, he could kind of play both sides, both the United States and the Soviets, against one another. And he also wanted to build a dam on the Nile River. Now, the Suez Canal, geopolitically for Europeans is very, very important, right? Because that links the Europeans with Asia by going through the Suez Canal, which is easier than having to go all the way down the coast of Africa and then coming all the way back up to get to Asia. So the Suez Canal is geopolitically very important for the Europeans. The English had control over the Suez Canal along with the French. Now, Nasser seized the Suez Canal in 1956. Now, this threatened oil supplies, right? Because the Middle East is a big source of oil, and the English, the French, and the Europeans needed that oil, and they felt that Nasser taking over the Suez Canal was a threat to them. So, in 1956, the British, the French, along with the Israelis, who were no fan of Nasser and his brand of Arab nationalism, launched an invasion of Egypt in order to retake the Suez Canal. And this was what was known as the Suez Crisis. Why do I keep doing that? The tops of the letters never come out right. The Suez Crisis in 1956. Now, the thing is that Eisenhower was in a very tough spot here, because the thing is that, we of course are allies with the English and the French and the Israelis, but it would be very awkward for the United States to basically, support these countries who were involved in what was basically an imperialist adventure. And the thing is that he actually said, and this is a really famous quote, he said, let them boil in their own oil. So basically, Eisenhower refused to get involved in the Suez Crisis, which soon passed when the English, the French, and the Israelis withdrew from Suez. So it was interesting that Eisenhower did not take the reflexively hawkish position, which would be to somehow, assist his English, French, Israeli allies in order to defeat Nasser, who was neutral in the Cold War. But Eisenhower refused to get involved. Now, this brought the whole issue of the Middle East to the forefront in the 1950s, and Eisenhower came up with what he called, or what the press called, the Eisenhower Doctrine. Now, the Eisenhower Doctrine said the U.S. would help any nation in the Middle East that was under threat of being taken over by the communists. Now, again, this is a response to the fact that the Russians are meddling, becoming a lot more meddlesome in the Middle Eastern countries. Now, even though Soviet intervention or meddling in the Middle East was seen as a threat to the United States, the bigger factor in Middle East politics at this time was Arab nationalism, because Nasser was trying to unite other Arab nations behind his vision of nationalism, saying that we have to assert ourselves against the Israelis on this side, and also against the Americans, who are really trying to throw their weight around in the Middle East. OPEC was founded in 1958 in order to harness Arab economic influence. U.S. troops actually landed in Lebanon in 1958 to stop communist plottings that apparently were happening in Lebanon. The United States actually did begin, throwing its weight around in the Middle East in a response to Cold War politics, and despite the fact that Eisenhower had taken a very hands-off approach during the Suez Crisis. Now, switching gears a little bit, in the 1950s, which we'll talk about in our subsequent videos, we'll talk about domestic policy in the 1950s. Generally, the 1950s were seen as a time of peace and prosperity, which was generally true. But the Cold War was continued to be on people's minds pretty constantly during the 1950s. What really scared a lot of Americans was in 1957. The Soviets launched the first satellite in outer space, Sputnik. Now, what this meant was the Soviets were the first ones to get into outer space, not the Americans. And that really scared a lot of Americans. Like, how did the Soviets get to outer space first? Sputnik 2 was launched a month later with a dog. So the Soviets launched two satellites in outer space, and we hadn't even gone to outer space yet. So starting in the late 1950s, as a response to Sputnik, the United States decided that we have to improve math and science education. Why are the Soviets getting there first and not us? So we doubled funding on math and science education. We also increased funding on missile development. NASA was established as a response to Sputnik, so the United States could have a space program of its own. We also began directly funding colleges, particularly math and science programs. The AP program, Advanced Placement, actually started as a response to Sputnik, saying we have to improve education, math and science education, in order to compete with the Russians. And of course, AP was then expanded to cover other things, American history, for instance, U.S. history, for instance. Now, in 1959, Nikita Khrushchev actually spoke before the United Nations. So he's actually visiting the United States for the first time. And in response to that, Vice President Nixon went to Moscow. And in 1959, Nixon actually launched what was known as the kitchen debate with Nikita Khrushchev, where they compared the values and virtues of capitalism versus the values of communism. And the thing is that this really, if we were in class, I would show this to you, but this really was unbelievable, where Vice President Nixon, Khrushchev are really going this back and forth, almost playfully, talking about the virtues of communism and capitalism. Khrushchev said, your children will live under communism, and Nixon said, your children will live under freedom. Interestingly, Nikita Khrushchev's son later moved to America and became an American citizen. So who won that one, right? So this might signal in some people's minds better relations with the Soviets, the fact that the Vice President of the United States and the Soviet dictator can actually engage in this kind of exchange. But in 1960, an ugly incident happened where a spy plane, a U-2 spy plane, we had been spying on the Soviet Union pretty continually, but a U-2 spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union. The pilot was actually taken prisoner. The United States claimed it was a weather plane, which was, of course, preposterous. And Khrushchev got very angry, and he cut off peace talks or any sort of talks with the United States, even though playing games a little bit, because he had to know that the United States had been spying on the Soviet Union pretty continually. It just, in the U-2 incident in 1960, we got caught. Now, one of the Cold War issues that really took on great importance for the United States in the late 1950s was the communist takeover of Cuba. Now, Cuba is only 90 miles from the United States, and this struck terror in the hearts of many Americans, the fact that the communists were now so close to us. It's one thing that being thousands of miles away in Russia and Eastern Europe and China, but it's another thing to have them 90 miles from us. Now, a little bit of background. The United States had been involved in Cuba for decades. Remember, in the Spanish-American War, which we waged in order to free Cuba from the Spanish, and the United States never really took its fingers out of Cuba in the subsequent 60 years. Cuba was basically used as a playground for rich Americans. It was where you could actually get a quickie divorce, where you could go gamble, where you could get an abortion. All the things that really weren't allowed in the United States, people used to go to Cuba to do. The organized crime, the mafia, set up a base in Cuba. If anybody's seen The Godfather, a lot of the incidents from The Godfather 1 actually take place in Cuba. Also, large areas of Cuba were actually owned by American business interests, particularly American sugar companies. And this caused a tremendous amount of resentment in Cuba at this Yankee meddling in their country. Now, making things worse is the fact that the brutal dictator of Cuba, a man named Batista, was actually supported by the United States because he was seen as, somebody who was friendly to American interests. He was extremely brutal, extremely corrupt. He used to hang political prisoners, kill them, and hang their bodies on lampposts through the streets of Havana. He also, for $250,000, you paid him a bribe. You could do anything you want in Cuba. So there were a lot of problems in Cuba. that shouldn't be forgotten. You know, as bad as Castro might be, the thing, or might have been, the thing is that the system that was in place in Cuba before was also pretty bad. Now, entering into this chaotic situation in Cuba in the 1950s was a man named Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro was very young. He was in his late 20s, early 30s during this situation, and he decided to lead a revolution, a rebellion against Batista. He was arrested, put in prison, then released, which was probably a foolish mistake by Batista, because when he was released, he continued his revolution against the government, the Batista regime. Now, it's important to note that at this point, Castro was not officially a communist. In fact, he denied being a communist. And there were a lot of people in the United States who actually supported Castro because Batista was so brutal. So anybody who kind of came and got involved and, you know, perhaps would overthrow Castro was welcomed by some people in the United States. In 1959, Castro and his group of rebels overthrew Batista and assumed dictatorial control over Cuba. Now, the thing is that the United States kind of took a wait-and-see attitude in the beginning, but things began going really, really badly because Fidel Castro nationalized property owned by the United States and the United States business interests and redistributed it to the people of Cuba as he saw it. And this led to a cutoff of relations between the United States and Castro. Now, that made Castro drift more and more into the Soviet orbit, and he officially embraced communism, said he was a communist. And this was an unbelievable score for the Soviet Union, right? To actually get an ally so close to the United States. And it was a moment of real fear for the United States that the communists were so close. The CIA launched no less than 600 different attempts to overthrow Castro in various ways. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans began escaping the United States, going to Florida in particular, who felt that they were on the outs with the new Cuban regime. And Castro, this really needs to be said. 1 million refugees came to the United States. And this really needs to be said because it came up during the presidential campaign a few months ago when Bernie Sanders praised Fidel Castro's efforts at literacy and healthcare. And some people on the more left side politically, you know, tend to look at that, those positive aspects of the Castro regime. But the thing is that Castro was unbelievably brutal. It was a police state. It was a communist police state where those who were opposed to Castro were arrested, or worse. There was no free speech. There was no freedom of religion. There really was no economic mobility at all. Everybody, well, I guess if you were very, very poor, you know, you had a little bit more than you had before. But the thing is, everybody pretty much was poor in Cuba, and that's the case up to the present day. In fact, it's even worse. Since the Soviet Union fell apart in the 1990s, so they lost that ally. But Cuba is under Castro, and to this day, it's a repressive police state with none of the civil liberties and values that the United States, that Americans enjoy. There's no elections. You can't speak out against the government. You name it. There are really no rights for the average person in Cuba. Most people live on very, very little money. One meal a day on average. The education system might be great, but at the same time, you only make $20 a month. So even if you're a doctor, so education's good, but to what end, you could argue. But people on the left say, well, look at the way it was before. This is actually a big improvement for the people of Cuba. But I don't think that most people who lived in under Castro would agree with that. We can say that Batista was bad, Batista was brutal, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that we should say that Castro was good. And also, the Soviets having an ally like Cuba so close to the United States could potentially have existential consequences for the United States, because ultimately in 1962, which we'll talk about in subsequent videos, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. where Cuba, where Soviets launched missiles, or at least not launched, God forbid, they actually had missiles in Cuba pointed at the United States, which potentially could have meant nuclear war. All right, guys. So thanks for listening. I really want you guys to check this channel every other day for a new video. Make sure you're watching the video from beginning to end, so we don't miss any material. All right, guys. So I'll see you soon, and take care.